Boom! Today we're going to be talking about how to get the most crisp and clean footage out of your camera, whether it's your iPhone or your Sony or your Canon, whatever it is. This applies to every single camera. So let's get into it. So there's a few rules that you're going to want to follow whenever you're shooting on any camera, and there's settings that you can find even on your iPhone. And these settings include frames per second, shutter speed, aperture or iris if you're on a cinema camera, and ISO, which is like the gain or the output of signal to the sensor. Once you figure out all four of these things, which we'll break down here in a second, you can create the crispest and cleanest image with any camera that you have. And then after this, it no longer necessarily matters how good of a camera you have. Now, you can't be filming on a potato, but at the same time, if you know what you're doing with the camera settings, you can make nearly any camera look professional. So let's start with the frames per second really quick. We have 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. These are the most common ones. You have some other weird ones like 25 frames per second, which they use in England. You have 120 frames per second, 240 frames per second. It goes all the way up as high as you want. It just gets more expensive. But in the normal cameras that you and I use, it's gonna be 24 frames, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. So what does this mean? It means whenever you're shooting in 24 frames per second, there are 24 pictures being taken every single second. And whenever the camera puts these pictures together, it creates a moving image. And so whenever you're shooting in 24 frames per second, this is what is considered like a cinematic style of recording. This is what they film majority of Hollywood movies in. It looks the most natural, it looks the most cinematic, and it's the easiest to watch for long periods of time. Whenever you move up to 30 frames per second, this is just becoming a preference thing between these two. Whenever you're filming a live event or you're live streaming, most of the time, this is in 30 frames per second. If you're watching a live television event, most of the time it's in 30 frames per second. 60 frames per second is whenever you're wanting to start slowing stuff down a little bit in post. This gives you more frames in order to capture more data, and whenever you slow it down, it doesn't look choppy because there's enough frames to fill in the gaps. So that's your frames per second. Depending on what you're filming is how you're going to determine what exactly you're filming in. If it's a talking head, do 24 frames per second. If it's a live event, do 30 frames per second. If you're wanting slow motion shots, do 60 frames per second. Okay, the next thing that you're going to want to dial in is your shutter speed. And so try to stick to this rule as much as you can and keep it as close as possible. And all you're going to do to find the right shutter speed, you're going to double the frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, it's 48. So you're going to be shooting in 1/48 on the shutter speed. Majority of cameras that aren't cinema cameras, they don't have 1/48, so you're going to want to stick to 1/50. Now, you can move this. It's going to make the image look a little bit different, and if you need to adjust it slightly due to exposure, make sure shutter is like your last resort. So keep it on 1/50 for 24 frames. If you're shooting 30 frames per second, do it 1/60. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, try to stick around that 1/125 mark and you will be fine. Shutter speed is interesting where it introduces a certain amount of motion blur, and it can also make your footage look very stuttery and choppy at the same time. The third thing is going to be your aperture or your f-stops on the lens that you choose. Now, this applies more to an actual camera as opposed to an iPhone. You can still control some of those settings artificially. The iPhone uses a cinematic mode in the regular camera app, and you can change your f-stop. It's a little circle with an F inside of it. What this does, this lets more light into the lens, first of all, so you don't have to up your ISO or adjust your shutter or anything else in order to get more light onto the sensor. So if you're filming in a dark place, make sure to open up all the way if you don't have any lights you can introduce. Also, something to note that just because you have it all the way open doesn't mean that it's going to be the clearest image. So usually the clearest image on a regular lens is going to be around f6 to like f10. I think, in my personal opinion and what I've seen in the field, it doesn't give you as much background blur, but you don't always necessarily need as much background blur. If you meet in the middle, some lenses go from f1.4 all the way to f22. If you meet somewhere in the middle, it's going to be more clean than if you were to shoot in f1.4 or f22. So remember, that is all honestly preference and the amount of light you have access to on your location. The last thing that we are going to talk about is the ISO, which is basically the amount of signal being sent to the sensor, and so it becomes more sensitive to light. The only thing with this, I would suggest always keep it as low as you can, and if you have to go higher, you can go higher, but it's going to look grainier and grainier as you go up the ladder. So ISO, you want to keep your ISO at around 50 to 100 ISO if you can help it. There are times where I'm moving it between 100 and 1000, sometimes even 2500 to 3000 if it's in a darker space. But just something to note, the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image, and the more you shoot that ISO up, the more grain you introduce, the more noise you introduce into the image. So ideally, in a perfect world, if you're shooting a YouTube video or a talking head, do 24 frames per second, 1/50 shutter, open up your aperture on your lens to like 2.8 to 4 and set your ISO as low as you possibly can. And if you need more light, bring in an additional light to make up for that lower exposure. Hope you guys learned something today. If I missed something, make sure to leave it in the comments. If you haven't subscribed, please make sure to hit subscribe. We are at 155 subscribers as of the time I'm recording this, which is actually insane. We've doubled in the last month, so thank you if you've hit the subscribe button already. If you want to see more videos like this, let me know. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out on Instagram, on Facebook, at Darren Dravon. Make sure to go give me a follow. Make sure to also join the Howdy Media Insiders group on Facebook. The link is in the description, completely free. We go live every single week. So we'll see you guys in the next video.